Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about world affairs and the people who shape it. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch, and in this show we discuss topical global issues and have in-depth conversations with personalities in foreign policy. Global Dispatches is presented in partnership with Humanity in Action, an international educational organization, and I am a Humanity in Action Senior Fellow. My guest today, Suzanne DiMaggio, specializes in what is called Track 2 diplomacy with countries that have limited or no diplomatic relations with the United States. In practice, this has meant that she has spent countless hours over the last nearly 20 years in meetings with North Koreans and Iranians. Those encounters have led to some major diplomatic breakthroughs. We kick off defining our terms a little bit. She explains what Track 2 diplomacy means as opposed to, say, quote, back-channel diplomacy. We then preview an upcoming major summit between Kim Jong-un and South Korean President Moon Jae-in. And that meeting, of course, will lay the groundwork for the Trump-Kim meeting, scheduled at this point sometime in May or June. And we discuss the diplomacy surrounding that meeting in great detail. So as things heat up with North Korea in the coming months, Suzanne DiMaggio is someone that you will see quoted often on TV and in radio, and so I wanted to use our conversation to learn how she got involved with this kind of very unique diplomatic endeavor, and she has some really great stories to tell. And I should say these stories also include her experiences facilitating Track 2 diplomacy with Iran, which led to some really key breakthroughs. As always, feel free to get in touch with me using the contact button on globaldispatchespodcast.com. I do love hearing from you. I love knowing what's on your mind and also your suggestions for people I should interview or topics I should cover. You can also hit me up on Twitter at Mark L. Goldberg. Okay, now here is my conversation with Suzanne DiMaggio, who is a senior fellow with the New America Foundation and director of the U.S.-Iran initiative at the New America Foundation. Hey folks, Northwestern University is seeking candidates for their online Master of Science in Global Health program. Learn how to make a meaningful difference in places where it's needed most. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com and click on the ad to learn more, or go to sps.northwestern.edu/global.
Well, the way I define back channel, and I think many people do, is it implies that you're actually working, you're independent, but working on behalf of the government. So even though you might be unofficial, you're taking on a mission, working or representing the U.S. government. And that's different from what I do, certainly.
Mm-hmm. So what's then Track 2? It's when you it's sort of like cultural exchanges or just informal, non-sort of affiliated?
Well, the easy way to look at it is Track 1 is formal government-to-government relations. So that's communications and relations between governments on a normal basis. Track 2 is independent representatives, usually NGOs, scholars, interacting with governments or representatives of governments. So that's the main difference. And then to make things even more complicated, there's something called Track 1.5.
Oh, do tell.
And that is, and that's technically probably closer to most of the work I do, because when you're interacting with governments that the U.S. has very infrequent official relations or no official relations at all, you have a tendency to be dealing with the governments of those countries. Mm-hmm. So in the case of North Korea, that's certainly the case. There's no tradition of non-governmental organizations in North Korea. So you're really dealing with the government, hence the term Track 1.5.
Okay, no, that makes sense because you on the American side are not a government official, but they are.
Absolutely.
So we that's a very helpful defining of terms because I believe I suspect we'll be kind of tossing out these terms throughout this conversation, given the nature of your work over these years. But I would love to kick off by getting your take, your perspective on this upcoming meeting between Kim and Moon, which is, I suppose it's happening just a couple weeks from when we're talking today, which is, when was it, Thursday, April 16th or something like that?
I think it's actually happening on April 27th.
Mm-hmm. April 27th. Okay.
So towards the end of the month. And I think it's, seems like a lot of preparation is going into that particular summit. And obviously it is a momentous occasion for the leaders of both North and South Korea to be meeting. If we step back a little bit, we can see it's really the culmination of a great deal of diplomatic effort, I think, exerted by President Moon of South Korea, extending dialogue to Kim Jong-un. And I think the South Koreans have done a lot of heavy lifting in terms of diplomacy to get us to this point. And in terms of timing, I, for one, am reassured that this summit is actually taking place before the proposed Trump-Kim Jong-un summit. I think the sequencing in this case is correct.
Why is that? Like, what's significant about the sequencing?
Well, I do think one of the things I'm concerned about is if there has been enough preparation for the Trump-Kim Jong-un summit. It's a short amount of time, and there is some direct dialogue, but I do think having the South Koreans being able to meet Kim Jong-un face-to-face, I think that would be a very important opportunity for him to discuss with Kim the expectations that President Trump might have in a summit, and actually maybe to make some progress on coming to a common understanding of what those expectations are and how to get there.
Presumably, there's also some outcomes in terms of like the bilateral relationship between North and South that one might expect from this kind of meeting.
Absolutely. I think that will be the primary topics for discussion, because there is this ongoing inter-Korean dialogue, and that includes a whole set of issues not necessarily related to U.S.-North Korea relations. Mm-hmm. So that is, in and of itself, an important set of discussions.
So it's interesting. So there's kind of like two ways to think about the outcomes of this meeting. One in terms of the North-South relations, the other in terms of the ways at which it serves as a prelude to the Trump-Kim meeting.
Yeah, I think that's right. The way I look at it is I see the inter-Korean dialogue, and then hopefully the U.S.-North Korea dialogue will get up and running. I see them as complementary tracks. And I think if I understand it correctly, I think one of the goals is at some point to then have a trilateral meeting. That would be U.S., South Korea, and North Korea.
So what outcomes specifically can you see sort of feeding into from the Kim Moon summit? Do you see feeding into the Trump Kim summit? Is there like what's like our terms of reference might be defined, or like what sort of ideas or things might feed into that?
Maybe some general principles on how to move forward with dialogue. And this is not something that the U.S. hasn't already discussed with North Korea in previous attempts to have engagement. So I don't think it would be recreating the wheel, or reinventing the wheel, I should say. But I do think knowing how assertive President Moon has been in pursuing dialogue, I think it would be a great opportunity for him to review directly with Kim an agenda that would work for a U.S. DPRK dialogue.
And like, what would elements of that agenda be, do you think?
Well, I think denuclearization is obviously going to be the top of the list. And here, it seems, at least what we're hearing in recent days, a confirmation that the North Koreans have agreed to discuss denuclearization is actually quite a positive step. But I think other things that would be on the agenda include nonproliferation. I would certainly think that any discussion about gaining reassurances from the North Koreans that they will not sell or transfer nuclear weapons, nuclear-related technology, and even chemical and biological weapons would be a priority agenda item for the United States.
On this question of denuclearization, I think actually that the media has done a pretty good job of explaining how the two sides here, the U.S. and North Korea, approach this question, this definition of what denuclearization means in two different ways. Could you maybe sort of, for people who are unaware, sort of explain what the different definitions of this denuclearization idea are and why that's significant, that sort of there is some ambiguity in this term?
Yes, it is, I think, an important issue, and my hope would be that this would be clarified before Kim and Trump meet, either in face-to-face meetings between Americans and North Koreans as preparation. So the main difference is in the past, we've seen North Koreans think of denuclearization as relating to the entire peninsula. And even we could say the Northeast Asian region. So the expectation there would be no U.S. strategic assets in the region that are nuclear capable. Some even interpret it to include a dismantlement of the nuclear umbrella we provide to our allies in South Korea and Japan. I mean, it's a rather extensive definition, and you could see how that would be unacceptable at any point in the near future or even midterm future. And I think the U.S. Perspective on denuclearization is specifically on North Korea's nuclear program when we talk about denuclearization. But clearly the North Koreans see it more as a reciprocal way of looking at it.
Can I ask, and I don't mean to have you sort of predict the future, but what are your expectations, or how high are your expectations for this meeting? I mean, I'm actually personally, you obviously have you're closer to this. I'm not convinced that this meeting's going to happen in the first place. But I'm wondering sort of what you expect, or if there will be any meaningful outcome. I mean, we're also seeing that this meeting's happening now that, John Bolton is the ambassador who has been, adamantly opposed to these kinds of talks and some of the concessions that might be embedded in diplomatic solutions. So I'm just sort of wondering what your expectations are.
I actually think it is going to happen, for better or for worse. And, keep in mind, originally the time frame floated was sometime in May, and already now we heard President Trump say maybe early June. So maybe it will be delayed, but I think it will happen. And if it's delayed, that isn't necessarily a bad thing. That's more time for preparation. So I think there are two. I would assess two key expectations on the part of President Trump. In other words, how would President Trump measure this, whether or not the summit is a success? And I see two main areas. The first is that he can come out of the summit and say that he was able to have great chemistry with Kim Jong-un, that he was able to do what no other American president has done before, and that is to be able to build a relationship with a leader of North Korea. I think that would be very important to him. And given his inclination to, or his like for authoritarian types, I have very little doubt that he'll be able to accomplish that.
Yeah.
But the second thing is more tricky. It's trickier, and that is, I think he wants to come out of this meeting and say he reached agreement, or he got the North Korean leader to agree to denuclearization. So that's where the prep work really comes in. I think before they even get to the table, before they're even in the same room, that's where all the work needs to be done. And if the president can come out of that summit and say, we've agreed in principle that we are going to begin a process, and the end goal of that process is denuclearization, that would be a success. There wouldn't be any timeline to it, and certainly no concrete details. Then handing it off to the professionals and the diplomats to work out those details, I think would be a good next step, a necessary next step.
Now, I'm wondering on the flip side, one of my concerns about this meeting, and I think it's something kind of widely shared by, by liberals, say, like me, is that this meeting might be set up to fail, and that failure might accelerate the military option.
Yes. That's my biggest concern too, is that if it's disaster, then a failed summit will undermine any prospects for future diplomacy. And certainly with people now like John Bolton in the mix, you can see how they would use that as a excuse or a pretense to say, well, we've tried diplomacy with Kim Jong-un and it didn't work. Mm-hmm. So now we have to move on to other options, and we know what that means. Likely it means military options. So right now, the military options, I think there's a great deal of agreement among experts that those options are not viable. But in the scenario you just brought up, you can see how suddenly, with the failure of diplomacy, these options would raise their ugly head again, and they could appear unavoidable. So that is the greatest risk I see, and that's why I stress preparation, the key role of the South Koreans, I think, in helping to shepherd this through. And at the end of the day, for Trump himself, having him invested in this process, because let's be clear, he needs a win. Mm-hmm. And a deal with North Korea would be a big win for him. So I think that is one of the biggest things those of us who support diplomacy to resolve these issues have going for us, is mm-hmm. that this president has a gigantic ego, and he needs a win, especially in the foreign policy column. He has none, absolutely none. So that, I think, will be a big motivating factor.
Well, at this point, do you have a sense of which outcome is more likely?
It's really hard to say at this point. I think if, a lot depends on the U.S. strategy. If Trump and the American team go into this summit with the notion that they're going to put a piece of paper on the table that calls for North Korea to denuclearize in the immediate future, that's a non-starter. I don't see that happening. But and if they say take it or leave it, then obviously that's not going to work either. But if they go into the summit with a plan of denuclearization that happens over time and is a process, an action-for-action process, then I think that stands a chance. I don't think it would happen anytime soon, but it would be time frame to be determined. I think that's the only way this is going to work.
So as these talks ramp up and heat up, you will be someone that a lot of my listeners will see on TV and will hear on NPR. And frankly, they probably, already are. You're someone I always, when I see your name quoted in papers on the stories, I always be sure to pay attention. I would be curious to learn sort of the longer story of how you first got into track 1.5 diplomacy with North Korea in particular. And we could talk about Iran and your other work as well. But I'd love to sort of just first learn how you got started with North Korea on these kinds of informal diplomatic channels.
Well, actually, quite early in my career, I was working at an organization that was doing similar work with it was the Soviet Union transitioning into Russia. And it was really my first job out of college. And
well, what job was that? What was the organization?
It was the United Nations Association,
Oh,
which is
yeah.
an NGO
UNA.
here in
UNA
New York.
USA. Well, the UN
Exactly.
Foundation, which is now, I think, is a partner or runs the UNA USA, they support my blog and in this podcast as well.
Yes, I know that. That's terrific. So you're aware of UNA.
Oh,
So
they're great. They're great.
So I was the person, because it was my first job, that was tasked with going to the airport to meet the Soviet-Russian delegation.
Very cool. That was UNA USA. Wow, good. That's amazing. I didn't know that.
So that was my key job, and then we would have meetings here in New York, and around the table would be people like Brent Scowcroft, Condi Rice, Joe Nye, all the major names in international affairs of that day, and it was just fascinating to me to see how in such a informal context and atmosphere, how much could be talked about. And then I went on to see the Soviet-Russian participants go on to form the new government after the fall of the Soviet Union, which was equally fascinating. And my own personal interests have always been countries that, in terms of diplomacy, that the U.S. doesn't have relations with. So it was putting two and two together that this could provide an informal channel to those countries.
Well, can I ask, where do you think your interest in countries that U.S. does not have formal relations come from?
I wish I could tell you. I just feel it was just a gap that I saw in traditional diplomacy. I remember thinking early in my career that I would go into a government job, and I remember speaking to a diplomat, and I mentioned the countries I was interested in, and the response was, well, Suzanne, if you go into government, you'll never be able to talk to officials from those countries.
There you go.
And that was sort of a wake-up call for me. So I really felt at that point compelled to find a more entrepreneurial path. And I think that's why, although I work very closely with various governments, including our own, it seemed like a natural direction for me to go.
So on North Korea specifically, what was your first entry point into this track 1.5 diplomacy, let's say?
Well, it's so interesting because, while I was at UNA, my first entry point was, it was actually a track 2 that brought together representatives from the countries in Northeast Asia and the U.S., including North Korea. So also Japan, Russia, China, and the U.S. And so that was my first point of entry.
And what was the goal of that first kind of point of entry, that first track 2?
Well, it was looking at the idea of cooperative security in the region to advance stability and bring together, of course, North Korea with others in a informal atmosphere to discuss the many issues that divided us. And over time, being involved in those issues, I have to say I became a little disenchanted. It seemed quite hopeless, the case of North Korea, and that is when I actually turned my attention to Iran, which I thought would be the easy way to go. And that was almost 18 years ago. So
at what point did you find this? Did the hopelessness seep in? That was probably like around when the Bush administration came after the agreed framework sort of formally fell apart.
That's exactly right. Yes, and that's when I thought I continued to have a profound interest in North Korea and the region, but I thought for my own work I might want to try some other approach and other countries. And that's when I started focusing on Iran, which is equally fascinating. And then also a little bit later, Myanmar.
Well, can I ask, so it's interesting to me because I would not think, although it's obviously the case, that the skills of these kind of track 2 diplomatic initiatives are transferable across regions, that it doesn't take sort of a regional expert in North Korea to do it. It takes someone who is sort of an expert in track 2 diplomacy. Does that make sense?
It does. It makes sense. And I was just having this conversation. As you can imagine, I meet a lot of students who are interested in similar work and trying to forge a career in this area. So they're always asking for advice. And I was just having this very conversation. What's more important, the regional expertise or the functional expertise? I mean, in the case of North Korea, technically my regional expertise is Northeast Asia, but I also was gravitating towards Middle East. I really was not wanting to make a choice, even though throughout my career I've been forced to try to do so, and I've resisted. But in terms of the functional expertise, I think what I've learned over time is that, even we live in the technical age, and even with the advancements we've had, I've found that nothing can replace the value of face-to-face engagement, especially with adversaries, that happens over a sustained period of time. It's enormously important. And when our government doesn't have official relations with these countries, how do you achieve that? Foreign service officers rarely never get the opportunities to meet with Iranian officials, North Korean officials. So this to me seemed like a way to bridge that, to fill that void.
So you've been amazingly successful at this, and I guess I'm curious to learn, like, what unique skill sets do you bring to make these happen? Like, what are the skill sets embedded in facilitating these kinds of dialogues?
Well, I think first and foremost, you have to approach it from the position of what is your end goal? What are you trying to achieve? And for me and people I work with, it's always been clear, and that is to advance U.S. interests, plain and simple. And to work from there, unless you go into dialogue thinking, even with countries like North Korea and Iran, where the problems that exist between our governments are so profound and so deep, you still have to be able to seek and have the ability to see the potential for common interest as a starting point. I think that's very helpful. And then the other thing is it requires a great deal of patience and persistence, because you do hit a lot of walls when you're doing this kind of work, and you can be discouraged and demoralized, but unless you try to find other ways around those walls, you're not going to get anywhere. So I think it takes a fair degree of persistence, and also I think being able to work, being able to maintain access to your own government at fairly high levels, to ensure what you're doing holds some policy relevance. I think that's a skill that's developed over time. And to be frank, in order to do that, you have to have a certain amount of credibility.
Mm-hmm. So can you tell me the story of how your engagement with Iran began?
Yes, I can. It was actually, I was sitting in the UN General Assembly Hall, and this was in 1998, I believe, or 1999, and speaking that day was President Khatami of Iran. And he proposed something that he called Dialogue Among Civilizations in response to Harvard professor Sam Huntington, who had put forward the notion of clash of civilizations, in which he posited that a clash between the West and Islam was inevitable. There was no way around it, that we were destined to do this. And here was President Khatami coming to the UN to say, well, actually, it's not inevitable. We can do something about it, and our diversity actually gives us strength. So, of course, I was taken with that idea. But more than that, I really thought this would be a good vehicle to do some quiet track 2 around, if we can get Americans and Iranians together. So that was how the seed was planted, and then reaching out to officials at the UN with the idea, and also to senior Iranian officials themselves I mean, this is the great thing about the naivete of youth. Is you actually do things like that. And this was quite a number of years ago for me. And actually putting forth the idea and getting positive response was, I mean, it was what I expected then, but when I think about it now, it was pretty shocking.
So what was that first meeting like with the Iranians?
Actually, it was almost disastrous.
Do tell.
The first meeting actually was canceled. And just to get to that first meeting took a year of discussions of how we would do it, what the modalities would be, and what the agenda would be. And what happened was axis of evil.
Mm.
So this was, I believe it was March 2002.
Yeah.
And we had a whole meeting planned, and the Iranians canceled it. So actually that was a big lesson, because what for me, one of the lessons was for Track 2 to work, it's important during time, especially during times of crises, for us to continue. And that was really the case I made with the Iranians. And then we got things back on track, but it took, the first meeting wasn't until December of that year. So it took many months to get it back on track.
And what was that first meeting? Like, what was it like?
It was, we met in Stockholm. I think there were several Americans and several Iranians. And, for the beginning of this process, a lot of it, it's also a socialization process. And that's why meeting with the same participants over time is very helpful. Because at the beginning, you're really forced to just go through your list of grievances. Mm-hmm. You've done me wrong, I've done you wrong, and this is how. And there's no real way to avoid that. But suddenly, over time, you stop doing that. And when you meet, you can just start talking about the issues. We no longer have to go through that list. I think that's a sign of progress.
So, I mean, are you able to draw a line either straight or tangential from those early meetings to the JCPOA in 2015?
I think so, because early, I think in our first couple of years, we actually put forward some proposals that, at least in the parameters, look very similar to what the JCPOA turned out to be. Mm-hmm. I think even at that time, not publicly but privately to U.S. officials, we did come forward and endorse the idea of allowing the Iranians to do uranium enrichment on their soil. And keep in mind that back then they only had 300 spinning centrifuges compared to, the 20,000 centrifuges when the deal was finally struck. Mm-hmm. We would have gotten a much better deal had we done it back then. So I think in those terms, we were maybe a little ahead of our time, but I think also laying the groundwork for official dialogue to begin. I think we were helpful in that way.
And that official dialogue sort of began with the Europeans, right? I mean, and it was the Europeans,
absolutely.
Right? It was the Europeans that sort of impressed upon Condoleezza Rice at the time the idea that they should be I think it was like the EU3 or something like that. That was
that's exactly right.
Okay.
Yes.
See, I was reporting on this at the time. It's all kind of coming back to me now.
And we presented a major paper to Condoleezza Rice and members that she brought together, members of the State Department. What was unique about the paper is we jointly wrote it with the Iranians. I think that was the first. And we distributed it to two audiences, senior officials in our government, and the Iranians distributed it to senior officials in their government. But at the end of the day, the decision on the U.S. side was not to move forward with engagement at that side. And, the Iranians also, when one wanted to engage, the other side didn't. This is the curse we had been living for how many years. And, with the JCPOA, and particularly the secret official discussions that were led by Bill Burns, that was really the turning point, I think. And I think in those conversations, Burns was able to convey to the Iranians some important things, including the notion that the United States would be agreeable to allowing them to enrich uranium on their soil, with the assumption that it would be heavily monitored and verified. And I think that I don't want to call it a concession, but in a lot of ways it was a U.S. concession, really opened the path to the JCPOA.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I'm wondering what the parallel here is to the North Korea negotiations, just in that it seems like it started with you and your track 2 diplomacy, and then it sort of moved to secret talks that were track 1 secret talks, and then it became like a public thing.
So I think first let's keep in mind that both cases are completely different. I'm well aware that North Korea has a nuclear program. Iran has never had a nuclear weapons program and has never produced a bomb. And there are many other, I've traveled to both countries and they couldn't be more different. But I think my starting point for dialogue with both, and I drew lessons from the Iran dialogue for North Korea, is how do you engage an adversary? How do you begin that process? And that's where I think the biggest lessons are. And even as we move forward now with official talks and summit, there are lessons there to be learned. And I think also the deal itself, when you look at the Iran nuclear deal, one of its most innovative aspects is its intrusive monitoring aspects and the verifications that it puts in place. And what puzzles me is the Trump administration should be holding up this deal as a model for North Korea because the verification side is so stringent, and saying this is our new gold standard. Going forward, all deals we cut will have this element, and instead they're undercutting the deal, and I think it's sending a terrible signal to the North Koreans on different levels.
I don't know if you were watching the Pompeo hearings this morning, but he was asked by a Democratic senator, do you agree with the IAEA assessments that the Iranians have been abiding by the strictures of the JCPOA? And he said, yes. I have no reason not to.
There's no way to. Our own intelligence estimates indicate, and I think even Israeli intelligence backs that up. So we know the Iranians are complying with the deal, and I think now they're trying to make the case that they can't counter-argue against it. They can't argue against it. So now the mantra is we need to fix it. Well, I think first of all we need to comply with our own commitments before we move on to anything else.
So, when did your engagement with the North Koreans start? Like this time around?
Yeah, it actually began in around 2016, 2016, and really began in earnest during this last 2-year period, I would say, a little over 2 years now.
And what was the first kind of iteration of that engagement?
The first iteration was I was invited to Pyongyang, which was interesting.
That's a good invitation.
They had become aware of my work with Iran and the dialogue, and that intrigued me that they were interested in something similar. And of course, I was very skeptical because even though I wasn't involved in North Korean Track 2 for a while, I did try to keep up with what was happening, and it seemed to me not a lot was happening. So I really had some reservations about moving forward, and because it is a big effort to get these things underway. But after talking to the North Koreans a couple of times, I thought, I think it's definitely worth a try. So we then had a meeting towards the end of the Obama administration, And
what was discussed at that meeting in Pyongyang?
That the meeting in Pyongyang was really a way to just discuss a broader meeting we were planning in Stockholm. What the parameters of that meeting would be, what the agenda would be, participants. It was a lot of logistics. But at the same time, I think one of the things I tried to convey at that meeting was the process of Track 2 that I feel is the best way to proceed. I think it requires meeting over a sustained period of time, meeting regularly, and being in communication between meetings. And I know a lot of other Track 2s weren't doing that. So that was something I tried to impress upon them, how it was important to maintain that steady dialogue over time. And it's difficult. We certainly are not the well-honed machine we are with the Iranians at this stage of the game. And we may never get there. But for me, I think it's been well worth its time. And then in May 2017, in one of our meetings, a U.S. official did come with us, and that was the first face-to-face interaction between a Trump administration official and North Korean officials.
And that was the breakthrough.
Well, I think that discussion did lead to the release of Otto Warmbier, and the representative was Ambassador Joseph Yun. So he gets full credit for that. And then, of course, then he went to Pyongyang to successfully negotiate the release of Warmbier. The outcome, obviously, was not what anyone was expecting, but it was a breakthrough in the sense that the first interaction did lead to a direct outcome.
In your conversations with the North Koreans, I suppose what is a perception about North Korea's outlook on the world that the rest of us who do not have the opportunity to engage with North Koreans directly might not fully appreciate?
There are a few ways to approach that question. I think one of the ways I like to think about it is you really get a sense of how isolated they are in not only the region but the world. And also, when you talk to them over time, you get a sense of how high their threat perception is. Their worldview is really, it's a dangerous world. They don't have any friends. They have a lot of enemies, and they live in a region where, obviously, we're there in a militaristic way, and they feel that. So one of the reasons I do like to travel there is I do like to talk to officials in the place where they sit, where they work every day, and talk to them about these issues. You get a sense of how they see it and how they see North Korea's place in the world. And that, again, you can't read that in a book. You really need to do that and spend the time doing that. The second thing is, I think, we don't hear about much in the media and here and elsewhere about North Korea is a lot of the focus, at least rhetorically, by Kim Jong-un is on economic progress. So although you hear about his speeches and how he's emphasizing the nuclear program, the other side of the coin is economic progress, what they call the Byung-jin line. And I do think that this, if indeed they are serious, and in our informal talks they've made mention of this on many occasions, that once their nuclear program is what they say is completed, they want to turn their attention to economic development. Mm-hmm. And of course we have to test this. We can't take it at face value, but if it indeed is true, I think it offers the biggest point of leverage for us going into negotiations.
One thing I'd be curious to get your take on is, one assumption I have, kind of combining the threads of Iran and North Korea, is that, and I think it's an assumption shared by a lot of supporters of the Iran deal, for one, is that by undermining or pulling out or reneging on the JCPOA, the Trump administration is sort of undermining its own ability to achieve an agreement with North Korea. Do you think North Koreans see it that way?
Oh, I know they do. I think I've had some conversations with North Korean officials where the Iran deal has come up, even just recently, where one official made the case that if the North Koreans were to strike a deal with the U.S. and the Trump administration, they would have concerns about whether or not the administration would follow through on the deal. And they would also have concerns that if a new administration came in, that they would follow it too. These are legitimate questions. I mean, of course, North Koreans have cheated on past deals, but I think what strikes them about this case, the Iran case, and I think what strikes me about it, is the Iranians haven't cheated. They have fulfilled the deal. They have fulfilled their side of the bargain. And I think that's one of the things the North Koreans can't understand. And I can't say for sure, but I think certainly if I was a North Korean, one of the conclusions I would reach is that maybe even if you strike a deal with the U.S. and you fulfill your side of the bargain, it still won't be enough, because at the end of the day, the problem is how the U.S. sees the regime. That can't be reconciled. And that's a very bad signal to send to North Korea at this stage of the game. If our policy indeed is not regime change, and we do want to de-escalate and eventually reach a deal on denuclearization, then we should be saying, look, this deal, to make this deal with the Iranians, we had to hold our nose. We didn't think that we're not bestowing legitimacy on the deal, but we made this deal because it advances U.S. interests, and we'd like to do something similar with you. That's really the only way we're going to get to any real outcome if denuclearization is something we want to pursue.
Well, Suzanne, we're just about out of time. Thank you so much. This is so helpful. Is there anything else you wanted to plug or wanted to mention, or any other sort of parting thoughts you wanted to leave us with?
No, I mean, I think certainly when I first heard that President Trump had agreed to have a summit with Kim Jong-un, I cringed at first. And I don't think it's the ideal situation for many reasons. But I do think at the end of the day, a step towards diplomacy is something we should all support. Certainly instead of military action, which I don't see as a viable option. So what I tell people is, if you can help move this initiative forward, if you have ideas, if you're on the Hill and member of Congress, you should be speaking out in favor of diplomacy.
Well, thank you. This is very helpful. This is like a great scene setter for the next 2 months of diplomacy.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. I really appreciate your time.
Okay. Take care. Okay. Bye.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Suzanne. And I think that conversation does a really helpful job of sort of setting the scene for diplomacy over the next couple of months, not just with North Korea, but also with Iran. We're headed towards a fairly major inflection point in May, when the president has to decide whether or not to set in motion the leaving of the JCPOA. And don't forget to leave reviews of the podcast on iTunes. I still have some stickers left that I'll send you if you leave a review. Just send me an email. And another huge thank you to everyone who is becoming a premium subscriber on the podcast. I have another special bonus episode coming up soon that looks at I'll leave it there. I'll let the suspense build a little bit. Anyway, expect a new bonus episode hopefully sometime next week. Bye.
The views and opinions expressed in the podcast are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the policies or positions of Humanity in Action.